Okay, looking good. Looking good. Hi, everyone. All right. Well, we can get started. Welcome to the Interintellect salon on terraforming Earth and Mars with me and Casey. I'm Anton. I'm going to be your host for this salon. I've done a few of these. This is going to be my most Australian and probably one of the more technical ones that I've done. So if you haven't heard my Australian accent before, you're in for a treat because I've also been hanging out with my Australian mates all weekend. Um, Casey is a physicist, father, founder of Terraform Industries. Interests range from how to colonize Mars to what are the first things to send to Mars if you're going to colonize it. Um, I'll get Casey to introduce himself, who can probably do a better job than I am.
Yeah, pretty much covers it. I think we're mostly here to speak about space type stuff, and within immediate reach, I have about 20 different artifacts. Like here's a meteorite.
What's
Um,
your favorite artifact within reach right now? Is it that?
this is pretty neat. Yeah, this is like older than Earth.
Where did
Um,
it come from, and why do we have it?
well, it's left over from the formation of the solar system, and it fell to Earth about 20 years ago, and people cut up in slices and sell on eBay for about $100 each, which is yeah, it's like kind of a problem for my finances actually. Once I realized that you can just buy meteorites on eBay.
Buy meteorites, and not even doing
Yeah.
any value add to them. They're letting you're buying them piecewise. Let's talk about Terraform. What is Terraform?
Terraform is a startup that actually I started in this very seat about 3.5 years ago, and kind of been noodling on some ideas for doing something interesting in the energy space for about 10 years before that. But basically, finally came to realize that the missing piece, if you like, for the future of humanity here on Earth and in other places, was a robust and cost-effective way to convert electricity into chemical fuel, and specifically into backwards compatible hydrocarbons. That is to say, hydrocarbons that we already consume at $1 trillion scale. And that kind of a nice side effect of this, if you were able to solve the economic problem, would be that you'd solve the climate problem because it's not possible to synthetically create hydrocarbons kind of at unlimited scale indefinitely using fossil sources of carbon. Um, it's much more realistic to take them out of the sky. Actually, just occurred to me there is a way of making it out of fossil carbon, but we won't talk about that. So yeah, and about 3.5 years in, basically it's a three-part system. We've got a direct air capture component that takes CO2 out of the air. We have a electrolysis component that makes hydrogen out of water, and we have a synthesis reactor component that combines CO2 and hydrogen to make natural gas. The really neat thing is that this general recipe can be applied or adapted to basically every large-scale primary material that humanity consumes. So essentially, anywhere where you got access to a random bunch of elements, you kind of think your standard rocks or whatever, such as what's in that meteorite, you can turn it into the raw materials that we need for civilization, which is it's a very neat trick. It turns out that if you have enough solar photovoltaic panels and you spam energy at a problem, you can solve it.
Everything boils down to energy and mass. But let's take a step back. Aren't we supposed to be electrifying the energy distribution system? Why are we going back to hydrocarbons?
We're not really going back to hydrocarbons. I think electrification is a really powerful economic forcing function for electrification of road ground transportation, so trucks and cars, trains, ships to an extent, um, and also for heating. I think in many places we'll end up using electricity to generate heat, and then we'll store heat seasonally in giant caverns or whatever, giant piles of dirt, and then use that for heating or for air conditioning, obviously. Um, and so, everything that's currently powered by electricity will probably remain powered by electricity plus a few more things. And then you think, well, where are the two major sources of load growth in the future? One of them is AI data centers, and that'll be electricity as well, obviously. And then the other one is high-speed aviation. So just yesterday, President Trump issued an executive order to overturn the 50-year ban on supersonic civilian flight in the United States.
Oh,
Um,
Blake will be happy with that.
Oh yeah, well Blake was the one doing the hard yards on it, I think, along with a few other people, for months and months. But I think it's really critical that that we take a more consequentialist view of the outcomes or negative externalities of positive technology. So in this case, you say, well, let's put in place a noise regulation regime, and we'll place a limit on the amount of noise, and we'll impose a taxation, an economic incentive around trying to push that noise down over time. And that'll allow people to innovate and price the cost of booming parts of the country where almost no one lives. As opposed to saying this branch of the technology tree, we're just going to prune forever. It doesn't matter in 2300, in 3000 AD, in 30,000 AD, humans are unworthy to travel supersonically, no matter what, no matter how clever we get about adapting sonic booms and things like that. So it's a very, very positive thing. But if you want to be flying 50 million people in supersonic aircraft all the time, that's going to use a lot more fuel than we currently use. So that's it's pretty big area of demand growth for, in particular, natural gas. Then on top of that, basically everything you can see is from petrochemical industry. So all the plastics, paints, dyes, adhesives, medication, it's all made with the hydrocarbon products. And so we need some way of cutting that entire industry over to a sustainable source, particularly one that doesn't require you to like run giant ships halfway around the world to get it. There are reasons why that might not be the best idea.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about, photovoltaics, solar. Obviously the price has been crashing. The sort of pushback has always been, well, where are you going to get the base load from? So that's really two questions. One is how much can we do with photovoltaics, really? And two,
Yeah.
does that matter for Terraform? And if so, how?
I mean, Terraform is and actually, if you're going to cut all primary industry across to solar, the baseload question doesn't matter so much, because at the end of the day, if it's a very energy intensive process, you've got to run it off solar when solar is available and basically shut it down when it's not. And that's a bit of a technical puzzle to figure out how to do that. But once you figured out how to do that, then you're basically locked to the cost of solar for the future, and that cost continues to drop by about 15% per year. And that's a great wave to ride all day long. When it comes to baseload, I have a very minoritarian point of view on this, but I basically think that baseload is it doesn't exist. It's not a real thing. Baseload is a legacy business model that's being actively disrupted by solar and batteries. I wrote a blog post on this maybe five years ago or so that laid out in just agonizing depth. Over time, my blog posts have gotten slightly more accessible. Just like the fundamental math, basically explaining that as soon as you put any amount of solar and batteries on a grid, it actually destabilizes the existing economic equilibrium in favor of solar and batteries. So ordinarily, if you have like a new technology that emerges and an existing user base, you can start adding that technology, say electric cars, for example, and eventually you'll saturate demand, right? And like you'll access every possible customer that wants to access that technology at the available price. And over time, maybe the price comes down and you access a wider user base, or the appeal of that technology improves or something. But at the end of the day, the total addressable market for cars is whatever it is, and Tesla sells a couple million cars a year, and like that's doing pretty good business. For solar and batteries on the grid, it's a completely different situation, because solar and batteries combined together have these strengths that the legacy spinning generation just doesn't have. In particular, it's able to respond at roughly millisecond speed to variations in demand, whereas legacy grid is more like half an hour on a good day. And that just means that the pricing power for baseload power provision to the grid just immediately comes to the nearest battery. And so if you operate that battery, you basically you have to play the ultimatum game with all the cards in your hand against all the other legacy generators. You end up in a situation much like the people who are financing taxi medallions in New York City when Uber arrived. You're like, I have this business which is now like actively useless. Like the only purpose of this business is for Uber to like gradually lever money out of my hands for as long as they can. So that's my perspective on the baseload question. I don't think that legacy nuclear plants are like going to be turned off tomorrow, but at the same time, it's going to be pretty clear in 20 years' time that they're not really needed.
So, on the topic of legacy, how does this dovetail with the existing hydrocarbon providers? Because those people
Yeah,
tend
it's
to
quite nice actually.
their weight around.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, when I started the company, I thought, oh, this will be like the crunchy, West Coast, live within view of the ocean hippies will be like, yeah, this is great. You can make carbon neutral fuel and I can fly jets around. But I thought that the oil producers would be like, oh no, this seems rubbish. But actually, if anything, the opposite has been the case. The oil producers are really pragmatic. They don't really care where they get the oil. They know that oil is really hard to get out of the ground. It's actually a very difficult business. If you look into how many companies are like basically if either gone bankrupt or about to in US oil production in response to basically a price war with Saudi Arabia over fracking, it's a really nasty business. Like it's got to the point where your Mar and Par drilling companies need $100 million of cheap finance just to stay afloat, just because the cost of drilling and finishing these wells and the likelihood that they end up being profitable is so tenuous. So like, oh, you're telling me that on this land that I already own, that is already zoned for energy production, that essentially the environmental problems have been waived away permanently, we can put solar on there, and then we don't have to wait for like the local grid operator to get around to installing solar, installing grid power lines out to this land, I can just convert it directly into natural gas and put it into the legacy, gather lines and stuff that I've already built into the injection point that I'm still paying off, and that'll work essentially forever. And I don't have to go and refrac it every 6 months. That's amazing. Can we sign here? And I'm like, oh, well, we're still doing a bit of R&D, but, please go and visit. So it's kind of this,
So how does that business
energy first pragmatism.
how does that business relationship then work in practice? Right? Are they buying your equipment? Are they building Terraform franchises? How does this work? How do you actually make the incentives align?
I think the best way to do it is for Terraform to ultimately, be responsible for installing all the equipment and then operating it. Initially, I was like, it'd be great if I could sell these, off the back of my factory, and someone else would take them and deal with them. In practice, it turns out that the expertise required to operate basically anything in the hardware world is extremely specialized. Doesn't matter what it is. We saw this 20 years ago, and it was like, we can have a Mac repairman or a PC repairman, but like someone who does both is pretty rare. So you got to pick wisely. And we have that expertise, but almost no one else does. So I think for this foreseeable future, we'll be owning and operating. We may end up having like a long-term lease of that land, or even just taking it off the hands of the people who currently own it and operating it indefinitely. Which is a neat trick. Yeah, it's a neat trick to end up owning the land that you're producing solar power on, especially given that there's only so much land.
So how long until this meaningfully starts to make an impact on the carbon situation in the atmosphere, and what does that mean for climate change?
That's a really good question. Climate change is a really tough problem, and in my opinion, there's kind of three prongs of the way to treat it. The first is keep a lid on temperature right now via solar radiation management, basically putting some sulfur in the atmosphere. And the second is continue to like aggressively electrify our economy, and at the same time find some way to cut the existing hydrocarbons over to electric synthesis process like the one we're building. The reality is like we're not going to make a dent on the climate front until we're producing like majority of the fuels consumed worldwide, because actually like something like 90, I was like our biosphere could absorb less than 10% of our current hydrocarbon consumption. So unless like synthetic processes, including terraforms, are like 90+% of current consumption, and probably more like 98% of ultimate consumption, because we're going to induce a lot more demand by lowering the price, then in terms of like increasing the net amount of carbon in the atmosphere, we're not going to be able to address that. It'll be a great business long before that. It'll be a great and growing business long before that. But in terms of solving climate, it's basically like we got to win the final boss battle against the legacy consumers who happen to be consuming in places where they're also producing, which is pretty rare. Normally, like the oil's produced in Saudi Arabia and consumed in Europe, but there's a couple of places in Texas, for example, where like it's basically consumed right at the point it's produced, and it's very, very hard to disrupt that, because then you don't get like the cost of transportation on your side of the oil and gas. And then the third step is, what do we do about the trillion tons that's already in the atmosphere that we need to pull out? So it's like roughly 70 ppm of CO2. And again, the easiest way to do that, no one likes it, but the easiest way to do it is to pick one volcanic mountain somewhere between the tropics and grind it up into powder and throw it in the ocean. But it's a lot better than like flooding all our coastal shorelines. So
may want to talk in a little bit more detail about accelerated erosion and why that works.
Yeah, pick your favorite mountain. It's a neat trick. Yeah, bring lots of dynamite. There's probably
Walk us through it.
a couple of hundred. There's a couple of hundred tropical volcanoes that could just do this to themselves at any moment with the slightest provocation. That is to say, volcanoes have a habit of exploding. But it turns out that a lot of mafic and ultramafic rocks have essentially how do I phrase this? The same chemistry that underlies cement, which is to say you get rocks hot and the CO2 is released, drives volcanism. So deep in the crust, you've got carbonates, which are formed by largely by like coral reefs and things like that. They get subducted under the continental crust. They go down far enough and they get very hot and under high pressure, and the carbon dissociates and dissolves into the rock. And then that actually makes the rock much more plastic, which then causes it to be, the rock where this has occurred to be melted and then forced up through cracks, forming what's called like a cordillera arc, like a back arc basin. So if you think of like the volcanoes in the Andes, for example, or in Oregon, same kind of idea. You got some crust subducting under the continent, and then a couple of 100 miles inland, you got volcanoes coming up. And so when those volcanoes come up, the rocks that are being extruded onto the surface are depleted of CO2. And so if you grind them up and then throw them in the ocean, they can absorb the CO2 that's dissolved into the ocean from rainfall and sink to the bottom and kind of begin this process again. There's obviously thousands of times more CO2 in the ocean and in the in the rocks and the crust than there is in the atmosphere. But the key thing is we want it below us and not above us. So we've got to figure out some way to accelerate that weathering process. And actually, historically, like billions of years ago, there was a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere, but also the sun was somewhat weaker, and these things have been roughly in balance, not perfectly. We had snowball Earth for like hundreds of millions of years at various times. But we're kind of at the situation now where the sun is warm enough that we really want to keep the CO2 levels down, in the 300s of ppm, in order to, maintain the Holocene, the period of Holocene stable climate that humans have enjoyed for the last 10,000 years.
Who's going to pay for that? Dynamiting volcanoes.
Dynamiting volcano. It's actually not that expensive in the grand scheme of things. I would do it for free. If someone provides the dynamite, I will do the rest for free.
Which mountain would you pick?
There's one in the Red Sea. There's a couple in Indonesia. There's obviously some in French Polynesia. You could do it at multiple ones. The South Kerguelen Islands. You could just take one little hill off the corner of that. No one would notice. It's not an equatorial mountain, but it's a completely unpopulated island about the size of Tasmania in the middle of the Indian Ocean. There's some penguins and stuff there. I mean, just to take the Hawaiian Islands, for example, like there are uninhabited parts of the Hawaiian Islands that have recently been covered in lava that you could just do it with and no one would even notice. The Hawaiian Islands are much, much larger than you need for this. You only need about 1 trillion tons of rock. Anyway, yeah, could be a fun thing. But overall, this works out to like a couple of bucks per ton of CO2, which is hundreds of times cheaper than the next cheapest way of like doing carbon capture and sequestration.
So before I ask one of the questions that's coming in through the chat, why isn't anyone already doing this, since you could just trade the carbon credits, couldn't you?
That is a good question. Yeah, I'll just pull up the chat as well. There are a number of companies looking into accelerated weathering, but the voluntary carbon market has challenges. How mean should I be on Interintellect?
As mean as you want.
Okay, here's the fundamental problem.
This is my show. They can't stop me. It's too late.
It's too late now.
Yeah.
Here's the fundamental problem. The voluntary carbon market basically says we'll find a handful of businesses, and the starting businesses in this was Stripe, and then Microsoft, Amazon, and Shopify. And these are businesses that are, just put it mildly, not involved in primary materials production, and they generate huge amounts of revenue per ton of carbon that they produce. And so it's relatively easy for them to say, oh well, we can allocate a relatively small amount of our overall revenue, but a large amount of money objectively to climate change stuff, and we'll do this in a way to try and incentivize the development and cost downing of these carbon capture and sequestration processes. So Nan Ratzhoff over at Stripe has been running this program for many years, and she's done a great job. But basically, the premise is, well, we'll allocate enough money to capture 1 million tons of carbon. That's better than nothing. But in order to increase, say, if you ask the same question you asked me, which is at what point does it solve the climate change? You say, well, how do we get from 1 million tons to 1 trillion tons? And that's another factor of 1 million. And the reality is, there's just not enough excess, economic productivity in the entire global economy to perform carbon capture and sequestration at the $500 per ton level. If you run the math, it's $500 trillion. There's like 10 years of global GDP, all to do this, and there's just it's not going to happen. So it's kind of uncertain how to scale that business model. And so if you ask people who think seriously about this, they say, well, we'll need an act of Congress to allocate, basically quantitative easing, right? So like the government will print $1 trillion and they'll give it all to us to do this one thing. Don't think that's going to happen, and even if it did, it would be extremely inflationary, which I think we got kind of a bad taste in our mouths about that right now. Or you say, well, we'll put in place a carbon tax, which forces people to pay $500 per ton or whatever it ends up being at the point of sale, which will have the effect of putting up your oil prices by a factor of 5. Well, there's a huge defection risk there, right? So if China decides, hey, like actually I don't want to take a massive L for my economy and unwind 50 years of development and push 1 billion people back into like quasi Stone Age level poverty and starvation, then the process no longer works. So like the one kind of saving grace of the way that we're doing it at Terraform is that it puts the carbon capture upstream of the point of value creation. So if you want to generate the value, you've just got to go and get the carbon. And then of course we don't have to worry about the sequestration part, which is actually, in my opinion, more difficult than the carbon capture part, because we're turning that carbon into a valuable product, into a profit center rather than a cost center. That said, if you could get carbon capture down to a couple of bucks per ton, then $1 million goes a lot further, or $1 billion goes a lot further. And if it's just a matter of like diverting the entire like decade of production of Caterpillar's heavy machinery to like some lonely island somewhere to smash things up, then great.
There's a good question here before we transition on to loftier things. You once described Terraform as being a bet that the economics of photovoltaics become favorable enough soon enough. Has that bet paid off?
Well, I mean, it hasn't paid off in that I'm still like a relatively liquid like suburban dad who's not currently calling you from my private space station. But in terms of the bet that we made on solar, solar got cheaper faster than I've anticipated. I would say it's pulled our timelines in by roughly a factor of two, which has been it's pretty exciting. Yeah, I'll put it that way. Because of course you just don't know. Like the solar cost curve continues to drop. It's a bit lumpy, and every time that it flattens out for a bit, everyone's like, "See, I told you so. We're flatlining. There's no more advantages to be had." And then a year later, when it like suddenly drops another 25%, they're like suddenly very quiet about it. They're like,
And
"But
it
inflation." I'm like, "Well, inflation would make it more expensive, not less." They're like, "Oh yeah." Um,
doesn't work that way around. Okay.
yeah.
A 2x contraction in timelines. You're
So
essentially
just to put that in line there, in terms of taking solar power and using it to make fundamental materials. So in those, I include hydrocarbons, ammonia, synthetic coke, metals, including steel, cement, and fresh water. We're basically in the money already for like the beachhead markets for almost all of these things. And I think it'll be all over by the shouting by 2035. So it's like in the next 10 years, all these transitions will go from one end of the bell curve over the top and then down to the other end of the bell curve.
Mhm. Okay. Um, let's go a little bit further. Of course, it's called Terraform. Earth is already formed. Although we're trying to unform it from what we've been forming it into by accident. How do we build a self-sustaining civilization on Mars?
Well, that's a good question. No, actually, on the Terraform thing, I would remind the viewers, particularly the ones based in Florida, California, et cetera, that the landscape that you live in looks nothing like it did, 200 years ago, and that humans continue to curate their landscapes pretty dramatically. So, in particular, in California, our ability to get water onto the land by diverting it from the Colorado River and other places, and in Florida, our ability to get water off the land by diverting it to the ocean has made these places vastly more habitable for humans. And I actually think that mostly this is good vibes, and that we should probably continue doing that on Earth because there's many other places that'd be very pleasant to live if we could just put a bit more water on them. Taking water off is easier. Pretty much all the places where you can take water off have been done already. Mars, self-sustaining civilization.
Yes,
Uh,
the question.
it's a big question. I've written a couple of books on this quite a long time ago, but I reread them recently, and they've aged pretty well, which is nice. I think you can kind of wave your hands at this question a couple of different ways. One of them is you say, well, unlike say Iceland, medieval Iceland, where it was possible for people to survive with medieval level of technology, they could make small amounts of iron using what's called a bog iron extraction process. They could survive on sheep and limited vegetables and fish. It is not possible to survive on Mars without an advanced level of technology. Exactly how advanced, it's hard to say, but I'd say like 1980s plus at least. And so then you can say, well, what are the necessary components of an industrial stack from say 1990 or 1980 to now, and how many people do you need to maintain that industrial stack? And so you can look back at historical records and data and say, well, what are the countries that were actually able to achieve industrial autarky? Many of them tried, almost none of them succeeded since that time period. And the answer is maybe 5 or 6 in total. So we're talking like United States, maybe China, maybe Soviet Union for like a week, South Korea, Germany, Japan, and like a surprising number of otherwise rich and powerful countries, or maybe not so powerful, but like Australia, for example, rich country, 20 million people, no shortage of resources, never got close to it. Industrial autarky, never has. Probably could if it tried. So the number of people involved in these countries is always over about 50 million. And to be fair, like a lot of these people are doctors and lawyers. They're not all like, unfortunately, they're not all like industrialists and factory workers, but it's a number like 50 million people. And then at the other end of the extreme, you say, well, maybe we could just do self-replicating robots. So like 0 people and just like a machine that can copy itself, which is kind of what a self-sustaining industrial stack is anyway, except it has millions of people involved. And that's also kind of science fiction. a robot that's actually able to work at all is still considered pretty tricky to do. So at this point, people involved at SpaceX or whatever, it's kind of wave their hands and say, let's just say 1 million people in 1 million tons. It could be 10 times that or 1/10 that, but it'll be in that rough zone. So if in the time it takes us to ramp up starships to the point that we can drop 10,000 of them on Mars with 1 million tons of stuff and 1 million people, we can also push down the critical number of people for industrial autarky to say 1 million people from 50, then we'll be in the right place. But still, like, you need the ability to produce, if not every single thing that a MasterCard catalog, it's like 500,000 SKUs, and everything on Amazon, everything at Walmart, and everything at Mitsumi and all the other different industrial suppliers and so on. You need to produce enough things that your economy is efficient. And you don't have to look very deeply into this before you realize that the factories will have to be largely automated. So if you're familiar with programming, this is kind of like a kind of pyramid of abstraction that sits on top of the primary production. So in the very early days of computers, people were like literally hand coding zeros and ones. And then over time, they developed interpreters and compilers that allowed the intent of the programmer to be translated into machine instructions with a broader and broader kind of flexibility and greater efficiency on the part of the people doing the work, and less hand coding, if that makes any sense. And kind of as an obvious analogy here that might be helpful, I can go down to the local hardware store and I can buy a functional hand drill for $15. And then with me, the person who's not all that good at drilling, like standing behind it, I can drill holes all through my house if I really want to. And often I do. Now, if I want to go and drill holes in rocks on Mars, I could take that same drill, but getting the human to Mars to like hold the drill is going to be, rather expensive. So instead, I'll send a Mars rover built at JPL, which is a few mountains around the corner from me here, and that rover cost $2.4 billion. So like somehow between like the motor that turns the sharp thing that grinds holes in rocks and the thing that can do that on another planet without breaking down, the cost increased by a factor of 100 million. And so yeah, it's kind of fun to think about, like, the first group of people go to Mars and they set up the factory, right? And then once they've set up the factory, they set up a factory to make factories. And once they've done that, they set up a factory that makes, humanoid robots, that makes factories to make other things. And you kind of gradually recede up this chain of abstraction. And the idea is every single time you ascend one of these steps, you're able to increase your per capita productivity by, say, an order of magnitude. And that's necessary because over time, you're sending more and more people, you're setting up more and more industries. And at the same time, the legacy industry, say you set up your water industry first, that has to be able to scale to provide water for 100 people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, 1 million people, without having to put like 10,000 people in the Department of Water, for example. So yeah, it's just kind of fun to kind of draw up your list of primary industries, of which there are probably a dozen or so, and then figure out how you're going to do them all without needing a legion of people to do each one.
So obviously the hard question there is if we can actually build these primary industries without the need for people and ship them to Mars, we would probably do them on Earth first because it would just make them cheaper. The marginal cost of all these things could get driven down, right?
We already have to an extent, but the relative costs of humans versus other things on Earth and in Mars are quite different. So I think that actually one of my bugbears, if you like, or one of my persistent complaints is that if you're going to do something in space, it's better to do as much as possible of it on Earth first. So as an example, there are a lot of people who talk about building a water mine on the moon. Right? Instead of build a water mine, why do you need a water mine on the moon? Well, so you have water on the moon. What do you need water on the moon for? Well, making rocket fuel or something. Like, okay, well, we have rocket fuel factories here on Earth, and we have rockets that can launch rocket fuel into space. And in fact, it's pretty trivial to show that no matter how much rocket fuel you need and no matter where you need it, it's almost definitely significantly, like thousands of times cheaper just to launch it in bulk from Earth to wherever you need it in space than to fly all the way to the moon, set up your rocket fuel factory on the moon, and then try and fly it from the moon to wherever you need it in space. And why is that? Well, because you can mass produce rockets on Earth with factories where people can breathe the air and have access to social security. And on the moon, you don't have any of that. Right? And basically the same goes across the board. So it's better to, like, it's roughly 1 million to 1 forcing function to do whatever you can of something on Earth first before going to space and then trying to figure it out there. I can give you another concrete example. We launched Skylab in an afternoon, and it took us 30 years to build the International Space Station, right? And the key difference was Skylab was launched on the Saturn V, which was able to launch the whole thing in one piece, and the space station was launched on the shuttle, which took 30 flights. And at the same time, the shuttle was like this, roughly by the time they were done, roughly 1 in 100 chance of everyone dying death trap. So just the process of completing the space station had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of killing everyone, or say it has a much lower chance of killing no one. And in that process, it's obviously unsustainable. And now we're talking about like going and doing the same thing in a space station around the moon. It's ludicrous. It's absolutely ludicrous. If you decide you need a space station, and why the hell you need a space station, I don't know. But if you decide you need a space station, you're better off building it all in one piece on Earth than building a rocket that's big enough to launch it and then launching it. You say, well, building a new rocket costs billions of dollars. I'm like, yes, but building the space station costs hundreds of billions of dollars. So it's still cheaper to build a giant rocket, and then you also have the giant rocket. Starship, for example, could easily launch a space station the size, actually much larger than the ISS in a single launch as of today, right? Like Starship doesn't have to be able to land either the booster or the Starship part in order to launch a space station. And we can already land the booster. So, and you say, well, Starship sometimes doesn't make it orbit. I'm like, fine, make 2 space stations. It's they actually made 2 Skylabs. They had a spare Skylab sitting up the back in Marshall Space Flight Center for years and years. And when they tried to dust it off in the 1990s, the space station faction destroyed it.
Why?
I think the question answers itself.
No, it doesn't. I don't understand why they would destroy the Skylab.
The backup Skylab?
Yes.
Well, because they didn't even realize it was there. As soon as they realized it was there, they're like, this is a threat to the space station.
Yes.
So we're going to destroy it.
But dinky little Skylab, how could that possibly be a threat to your giant modular space station, even if that's the tack you're taking? Just make it another component of your modular space station.
It's considerably larger than any of the space station modules. Yeah.
Because of the Saturn V stack?
Yeah, I think Skylab was 6 meters in diameter or something.
How big is the largest diameter on the ISS?
I think like 3 and something. I'm not sure exactly.
That's very tiny.
Yeah. Like in the space station, you can kind of zoom through tubes, but you can't do like flips and bounces and stuff. Whereas if you look at the Skylab videos, you can see people doing like 10 minutes of acrobatics floating in pre-space, which is pretty cool.
Do you think when we start sending ships to Mars, we'll have mutinies in space, like we did with Skylab?
I don't even think the Skylab mutiny was really a mutiny. I think Scott Manley has debunked that. Debunked that.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Well, I wrote a technical commentary on the Mars trilogy, and there is a bit of that going on in that story.
I haven't read it yet.
But actually, astronauts are generally pretty professional. I think
Sure.
that like a reality TV show based on like astronauts being professional in space is maybe less compelling than like, I don't know, Pirates of the Caribbean or something.
I believe it, but the flip side of that is, how far do you have to push somebody until they do break under all circumstances? We haven't done anything like we haven't
Speak
done
for yourself.
a manned Mars mission.
Speak for yourself, Anton. Actually, that is an interesting point, and a lot of ink has been spilled on the subject. But it goes something like this: what is the stable attractor for political systems on Mars? And one school of thought says that survival on Mars is so perilous, and the systems that exist there are so vulnerable to sabotage, that you're going to have like a totalitarian dystopia to lock down control of all your essential systems, to stop anyone from harming them, and to prevent the rank and file from seizing the means of production and declaring their freedom or something. And this starts to veer a little bit into Tom Clancy, like Hunt for Red October territory, because we actually do have like pretty good analogies for this in the form of nuclear submarines and Antarctic bases and things.
Yes.
The other school of thought holds that surviving on Mars is so difficult that you will need extremely specialized people to do it. And those people will always have good alternatives. And that in order to get them to go to Mars voluntarily, you'll have to house them under like the greatest freedom that humanity have ever seen or ever had, because they won't accept anything less. They just won't go. They won't work. They'll have better things to do, which I think is also in some ways analogous to the submarine corps. So in submarines, for example, it's true that if you're on a submarine, you have no freedom, right? Your life is strictly regimented. At the same time, it's really hard to become a submariner. It's actually like within the Silent Service, it's considered very prestigious to get your dolphin, PIN or whatever it's called, your certification, at least within the Western submarine services. And 3 months on, 3 months off. It's for a particular kind of person, it's probably the best job on Earth. really, really fascinating. Like how if you're a 19-year-old determined to work on a nuclear reactor, you have no other choices. Um, and yeah, it's a pretty neat thing to do. We don't hear all that much about it these days, but Smarter Every Day did a great
It's a
tour of
silent
a
service.
Los Angeles class submarine. Yeah, exactly. Um, and you do have like maybe you don't have like a huge amount of freedom over like which way does the boat go, but it doesn't matter all that much because you don't there's no windows anyway, and but you have a lot of freedom over like how you execute your job to make sure it's the best that anyone's ever done. Um, so and every now and then, in the Antarctic stations, for example, you can dig up stories of essentially they operate in a form of like loosely controlled anarchy, and like once in a while someone will like lose their mind and they'll have to be thrown in the brig, but mostly people just get on with their lives and do whatever the hell they want. um, like in the Australian stations there are stories of people building like basically smuggling parts down over several years to build their own ski-doo so they don't have to sign out the the station ski-doo to like go on adventures and like not have to walk off the station. They can like go for a drive, stuff like that. So yeah, I'm not certain of the response, but I also think that like if you're trying to build you're trying to build a city where you're achieving like per capita productivity that's tens or hundreds of times higher than humans achieve by default here on Earth, you're not going to achieve it in like a slave labor colony. It's not going to be like Australia circa 1788 or like 1988 all over again.
I think there's a good question in the chat which I'll sort of bring up here, which is like there aren't immediate economic or defense reasons, which are the two reasons that governments usually do things to go to Mars. Um, which kind of raises actually two questions. One, what are good reasons to go to Mars? And two, to what extent does government involvement even matter?
That's a good question. Um, so a long time ago, I thought, oh well, you can make an argument of going to Mars around like backing up the biosphere, or maybe the window of opportunity will close at some point. And I think there is an argument about that, in terms of opportunity. Um, but actually, I think that like all the people I've ever met who seem determined to go to Mars aren't really able to articulate why. They just seem determined. And if you don't understand why, that's fine. You just didn't get the gene that compels you to explore. Probably you have a lucky if slightly boring life. But actually, like kind of the further I go through my career, the the more often I meet people who are kind of they rise every morning angry and determined to do something they're not quite sure what. And good for them, and good for all of us because they kind of drive the humanity forward as a whole. Many of them come to sticky ends, but overall it's a positive thing. Um, and then why involve the government at all? Well, it's going to be enormously
Spread the
expensive.
two,
Um,
right? Like right now,
um,
the biggest launch provider is a private company. The government, there's
that's
no
right.
government on Earth that launches more than SpaceX.
That's true. So Elon recognized, as did I at Terraform, that like if your business plan includes, and then the government writes you $1 trillion check, uh, it could happen, right? Like I guess that happened with if your business plan is making nuclear weapons, like that did happen. If your business plan is building nuclear submarines, that did happen. But it's pretty rare, right? And if your business plan says, actually, I can get value into the hands of my customers without having to involve the government, without having to have an act of Congress, without depending on the money tap being turned on through several consecutive administrations, so much the better. And I think they realized this at SpaceX more than a decade ago. Well, they say they knew it from the beginning, but they realized how to build Starlink, which actually both Anton and I are using right now. Um,
Yes.
and actually next year, I think Starlink's SpaceX's revenue, which is mostly Starlink, will exceed NASA's total budget. Now, of course, a lot of Starlink revenue is not pure profit, um, but um, but it kind of gives you an idea of the scale of the problem here. And actually, we saw the same thing in computing, right? Once Google figured out how to get really effective like plain language database search capability into the hands of billions of people, it was able to scale the quality of its other products accordingly, because it was just able to throw off so much revenue, like hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue a year. And the same thing goes with SpaceX, I think. They've kind of cracked that nut at this point. And then, of course, the other trick is if you're going to do the million people on Mars with SLS, it's going to take you 1,000 years and it's going to cost you $1,000 trillion. But if you can do it with something like Starship, then it might just be affordable.
Well, the thing is, of course, governments, yes, we can do it. We can get there with private industry, but the government's going to have an interest in anything that anyone does on Mars. They really do see it as their exclusive purview. So now we have this tension between people who want to go to Mars. We've got a business that allows us to do it, and then we've got the government's interests politically.
I think space people generally overestimate the interest that people in space, that governments have in space. I mean, part of the reason that the SLS is such a turkey is that I think it was kind of invented by like well-meaning staffers in an afternoon. And the reality is they didn't have Kerbal Space Program back then. So they didn't know what a horrible mistake they were making. And they didn't have time to like, talk to 20 people and find out the truth. If you go and talk to your members of Congress and their staffers and you aggregate all their collective knowledge on space technology, like I know 14-year-olds who know more. So it's not a criticism. It's just not something that's like incredibly salient to them on a day-to-day basis. It's not something that most people care about, know much about. It's a pretty niche issue. We've seen this in the past. There's just areas that governments care about, areas that governments don't care that much about, and where they don't care much about, you can often slip things under the radar. I mean, in some ways, the entire tech industry has done that, right? Like, I think if the government had been on top of, I don't know, like email or text messaging or something, then what we would have today would look, much more like the DMV than like the free high quality internet services we take for granted. And I know this because at JPL, I used the JPL invented email service for a while. They implemented their own version of email called Gems or something way back in the day. It was fine.
Didn't
Well, I mean, it was like
JPL put the first coffee maker online, I believe.
It would not surprise me that they like basically as soon as an idea is in the water, someone at JPL will implement a version of it, and then the problem is they'll often like keep on doing it the way they did it rather than cut over to the, like when the rest of industry catches up and figures out some way of doing exactly the same thing 10 times better for 1/1000th the price. JPL will continue to do it their way. Which, whatever.
Okay, so a bunch of follow-up questions here. What do we send in that first 1,000,000 tons?
That is a good question. I have a blog post in the works about that. I don't know the answer. There's a couple of pieces that are kind of non-negotiables. So like habitation, life support equipment, obviously, and then enough stuff to bootstrap your primary materials inputs. So you can import a lot of stuff from Earth, but probably you don't want to import water to Mars or your power, like fuel or something like that, and raw materials. So like undifferentiated dirt. So you need bulldozers and stuff to move that around. Machinery, all that kind of stuff. But by the time you got up to the full 1,000,000 tons, you need probably like a couple of hundred factories worth of stuff. So you can kind of do the math on it. Maybe you should. Anyone who's listening to this still should go and write there like the manifest breakdown. Split up 1,000,000 tons across 10 launch windows, obviously weighted towards the final ones, and figure out how you're going to bring all these.
What do you mean weighted towards the final one? What are we waiting?
I mean, like so you got 10 launch windows, but the first launch window will be like 5 starships, and the fifth launch window will be 100 starships, and then the 10th launch window will be like 10,000 starships. So obviously most of the mass is going later on, later rather than sooner, because you're kind of ramping up starship production at the same time.
What's the long-term plan for Mars then? Are we, is it a Kim Stanley Robinson style full-blown terraforming? What are we doing here really? How long do we have to live in tubes?
Well, I think actually you could build really nice habs that are essentially inflatable. Like you cover the ground in a huge layer of plastic and then pump it up and then anchor it to the ground. So you have like tensile columns. It's like take a air mattress and expand it by a factor of 100 or something, or 1,000 or something like that, and live under that. It'd be quite nice, like plants and stuff growing in the ground, shirt sleeves environment. But there, ultimately, you want to rip the dome down. You want to terraform. You got to heat the planet up. And you got to change the atmospheric chemistry and possibly change human genetics so that we can breathe the air. But yeah, I think that's a decision that's kind of one of the things that SpaceX does really well is they focus on what's in front of them, right? SpaceX has not put very much effort into figuring out what they take to Mars or how they take it there or what they do there, because until they have Starship up and running, there's no point. They can LARP all they want about how we're going to design the architecture of the Mars city, but until the Starship is like functioning, there will be no Mars city. So make the Starship function, then figure out the architecture. The Starship is the hard part by far.
They seem to be on track. Eventually, they'll reach orbit without exploding.
I mean, actually, I think of the 9 test flights they've done so far, 4 of them could have reached orbital velocity if they decided they wanted to do that. It's from the point that they reached to the point that would have been orbit. It would have been like burning their engines for another 10 seconds or something like that. They just wanted to drop it into the ocean off Australia. So that's actually, I don't know. The block two disappointed us all. But yeah, the hard part is, as Elon is always going on about, it's like you actually to make it capable of coming back and landing, so you can reuse the upper stage. It's really tough, but it has to be done.
There's a good question here from Brad. Are there any obvious problems that no one really talks about for actually having humans on Mars? Are things like perchlorates still an issue?
Yeah, a lot of people talk about this. They say, "Oh, until we solve the perchlorates, we can't go to Mars," or "Until we figure out how to not contaminate Mars, we can't go to Mars," or "Until we amend the Outer Space Treaty, we can't go to Mars." Um, I don't think any of these things are real issues. I think if you can build a rocket that can take you to Mars, you can go to Mars. Yeah, perchlorates. I would not recommend eating Mars dirt that hasn't been treated. But perchlorates are actually something that'll break down in a warm, wet environment. So once you pump up your dome, right? So say you've built a dome with a dirt floor and there's perchlorates there, and you pump it up and it gets moist because humans off gas water and you've got ponds and things there. The perchlorates themselves actually start to break down and they release oxygen, and then you're just left off with like salty soil and oxygen, which is kind of a neat trick. Um, yeah, so I'm not too worried about perchlorates. Like in the grand scheme of things, in the grand scheme of things, what's going to kill you if you go to Mars? Like, are you going to die of radiation? Are you going to die of like the effects of low gravity? Are you going to die of like homesickness? Are you going to die of perchlorates? No, you're going to die of burning up on reentry because your heat shield messed up. Like that's, um, it's one of these things. Like why worry about the thing that has like a 1% chance of killing you in 30 years? You should worry about the thing that has a 50% chance of killing you immediately.
I guess the question is more about a desire to learn some of the more unusual ways that Mars could kill you.
Oh, we will find them out sooner or later. Yeah. That's the thing, actually. I was just writing about this probably very early this morning when I should have been asleep. Um, the thing that frustrates me about the current space program um, is actually not that it's intrinsically dangerous, and it is, and it probably always will be. Right, just like getting on a rocket is just more dangerous than sitting on your couch. The thing that bothers me about it is that there doesn't seem to be a commensurate value to the risk being taken. Right, right. If you've got a famous rock climber who's devoted their entire life to rock climbing, and they have a fatality in the mountains, like pushing their sport to the absolute limit, if you think there's any value to rock climbing, then you say, well, they died doing what they loved and what they devoted their life to, and good for them. And it's kind of a risk they understood, right? But if they've just summited Mount Everest without oxygen and they get back down to the ground level, and then like someone runs them over in a car and then backs up to make sure, right? That's just stupid, right? And I kind of feel like the way that the United States has killed its astronauts, which is to say 3 in Apollo 1, 7 in Challenger, and 7 in Columbia. None of these people really, pushing the boundaries of human experience. None of these people were doing some sort of heroism that was really going to like had a possibility for a huge positive outcome. They were
Sure.
just rolling the dice in a game that was stacked against them over and over again, for no real good reason. And we're kind of in that situation now with the space station. Mark my words, the space station is structurally a lot more compromised than they're letting on, and they already have leaks they can't explain. There's known cracking in some of the modules. They think they understand that these cracks are whatever, but like it's a giant balloon and it's leaking already. And if one of these cracks in the Russian segment lets go, there's a good chance everyone will die. Right? Like the whole thing splits open, everyone will die because the air will suck out in a couple of seconds, and that'll be that. And then we'll say, well, no one could have seen it coming. That's bullshit. We've known about it for a long time. Now it's a different matter. If you're flying to Mars, you're flying 1 million people to Mars, and a couple of thousand of them don't make it, then it's still like 0.1% fatality rate. That's a much lower fatality rate than being Anton at my age. Right, at our age, about 1 in 500 people die in a given year, and obviously much lower fatality rate than riding motorcycles or rock climbing or raising children or whatever the other kind of crazy stuff that we do, starting hardware companies.
Yes.
Um, So so you say, well, and the flip side, the surviving 999,000 people are building, the first ever off-Earth city that is the stepping stone for us into the entire universe, um, which I think is meaningful on the scale of human experience and exploration.
When do we start shipping GPUs to Mars?
Oh, we ship them almost immediately. So yeah, so if you run the math on like what stuff do you need there and how much does it cost to make and how much does it cost to ship, you can kind of break it into three broad categories. The first category is stuff where it's actively harming you to ship it to Mars because it's relatively easy to make on Mars, and you also need a lot of it. So steel, gases, water, cement, basic raw materials, water in particular, fuel if you're trying to fly home. These are things that you want to be able to figure out how to make, per capita, like tons, if not tens of tons per person per year on Mars. Then you've got on the other end of the spectrum the stuff where, well, if you're going to Mars, you could plausibly pack a lifetime supply in with your underwear, right? So you've got like 10 kilogram or 50 kilogram per person manifest of cargo. You can easily ship a lifetime supply of essentially any pharmaceutical you'll ever need. You can ship a lifetime supply of flash memory and GPUs and computing hardware, chips and stuff like that. Maybe not the PCBs, but the chips themselves, the Taiwanese magic silicon, and all that kind of stuff. And then you got the intermediate stuff, which is like the kind of value add manufacturing. And then it's not quite certain because over time, obviously, it'll become easier to make it on Mars, right? So let's say electric motors, for example. Over time on Mars, you'll localize your supply chain for aluminum, for steel, for magnetic steel, for copper. You'll be able to wind electric motors, be able to make magnets, and make electric motors on Mars. And you can even make them with an almost completely automated system, right? I'm talking like drone motors, stuff like that. But at the same time, the Wright's law, if you like, the learning rate for manufacturing on Mars is pulling your cost down, but also the learning rate for making rockets on Earth is coming down as well. And rockets are in some ways more complicated, in other ways simpler to make than any given product you may want to mass produce on Mars. Like screws are pretty easy, motors are harder, computers, fully integrated computers are harder still. The cell phones, et cetera, are pretty tough to make. And at the same time, the factory you're building on Mars is on Mars, and if you've already got 6 Starship factories in Texas and you're building a 7th, well, that's pretty straightforward. Just like copy paste. And so obviously, like shipping stuff to Mars is going to get cheaper over time as well. So it's not really super certain, not super obvious to me whether ultimately it'll be cheaper to build your electric motor factory on Mars and operate it at scale, like so you don't import any motors at all. Maybe it makes sense to produce some motors on Mars in case the Starships break down or something. You want to have that capability locally, or whether it'll be cheaper long term just to import the kind of the vitamins. Like so, if you're building some machine tool, right? Like most of the cost is like a giant chunk of like looser machined cast iron. You can make that locally, and then you import the motors and the precision components from Earth and integrate them. Yeah, so it's uncertain. If you have a deep opinion on what the relative learning rate of mass transport of mass to Mars versus mass production of stuff on Mars, then write a blog post on it and send me a link to it.
Good. To sort of, photovoltaic prices decreased faster than you expected. What's been the most frustrating thing in R&D or manufacturing at Terraform? What's going slower than you
Oh,
want?
Jesus. Well, I mean, part of the reason that I went and did it was I wanted to learn what it took to run a hardware R&D facility, and really that's like throwing yourself into the deep end. And there's been a lot of hard lessons to learn there, and so I continue to be frustrated by how slow in the uptake I am. I've got a bookshelf behind me full of like lessons learned from historical manufacturing stuff, first person accounts from people who set up factories, Second World War or whatever, and you read it and you're like, oh yeah, it makes sense in the abstract. And
Yes.
then you go and do it in reality and you make all the same dumb mistakes and you're like, oh God, now I get it.
My experience is
um,
founders in general, because if you were the sort of person who's used to taking advice, you wouldn't do this in the first place.
oh, for sure, for sure. I mean, okay, so SpaceX actually is pretty notorious as a place that people go and they like get leveled up, right? And SpaceX has produced a good number of people who know what it means to run a successful hardware development business or
And
a
yet have
successful
not,
program or something
and
like
yet
that.
have not replicated SpaceX, which we've talked about elsewhere.
They have not, but in other business they've been quite successful. So there's a diaspora of Tesla and SpaceX originating founders of 300 or 400 companies that mostly have done quite well. certainly better than you would expect on average. And so you say, well, okay, how many competent managers has SpaceX and Tesla graduated, right? And how much money did SpaceX and Tesla spend in total? They were doing other things at the same time, but if you think like, what is the flux at which a SpaceX can produce competent managers divided by its burn rate? It's in the tens of millions of dollars per competent manager. Right? And if I look at Terraform, it's the same thing. We've spent $15 million something so far. I feel like I've leveled up at least one tier, maybe two, and there's 3 or 4 other people at the company who've also like greatly improved from where they started.
Yeah,
It's not a huge number.
We should beware taking cost as a target. Hey, see, we know what happened at NASA.
Well, you could always try and optimize and try and increase the number of like managerial skill per dollar spent, incremental managerial skill per incremental dollar spent. Yeah, it's surprisingly expensive, and that's actually one of the sad things about running government programs or even non-government programs where you're taking people who have managerial potential, and then you have them spend their lives doing things that don't actually add to the sum total of human wealth or experience, because you can't spend that time twice. It's gone. One of the great crimes I think at NASA and National Institute of Health and so on is you have hundreds of thousands of really smart people devoting their lives to solving problems that have been misallocated or misselected by people who thought they knew what they were doing, but they weren't actually following the gradient.
Yeah. Great. Do we have anything else anyone else would like to ask or state? Otherwise, we'll wrap up shortly. It's been very
informative. Couple other good questions here. I'm happy to burn down the questions in the chat here if you want.
Yeah, we've covered most of them.
The ones we haven't covered yet. Yeah. I agree with Austin Vernon on amount and peridotite. That's one of Mafic materials. Solar production, cloudy places in Northern Europe. Yes, of course they will be able to. The amount of solar variation anywhere that people live is like 20%, maybe 30% at most. There's a lot of seasonal variation, but Europe has long summers and short winters to make up for it, and you can store gas seasonally. It's not a problem. John Young snuck a sandwich onto Gemini 3. Hell yeah. Why go to Mars? I think if you have to ask that question, you'll never understand the answer. Ideal scale of economics for Terraform factories across different basic materials. Good question. Research it, write a blog post and send it to me. Are there any obvious problems that actually you can ask ChatGPT deep research about many of these questions, which I did when it first came out, and I was disappointed to see that about 80% of the results linked back to my own blogs. So I want other people out there to think about this stuff.
No progress whatsoever has been made.
So I think curious about balancing parenthood with work. Do I look well rested to you? And are we not building enough CO2 pipelines for e-fuels? What are your opinions on the Chinese e-fuel projects in Mongolia? We don't need CO2 pipelines. You want to generate the CO2 and hydrogen at the point where you're doing the synthesis. So actually you need to collocate everything. Otherwise you just have parasitic costs that are increasing the cost of your fuel. And fuel is basically it's a commodity with like infinite elasticity. People will buy as much of it as they can get at the price they can afford to pay for it. Which basically means like the lowest price wins. So yeah, don't bother with CO2 pipelines and so on. Again, that's like waiting for an act of Congress. Like, oh, well, we can get this off the ground as soon as Congress like unlocks $1 billion for my hydrogen pipeline. No, it's never going to happen. Just do it all locally in one integrated system.
Why are the Chinese building pipelines then?
The Chinese are not necessarily well known for efficiently allocating capital, but they do allocate capital at least. So I will say that.
They do allocate capital. They built some rail lines here and there.
I think there are. Why does the United States not have a high-speed rail network? It's because we got rich enough to fly 737s 50 years ago. That's why. And 737s are just objectively better than high-speed rail for a country the size of the United States. This saddens my heart. I'm a train tragic. I have a dash of the traintism. I've taken trains in many countries on Earth, including in the former Soviet Union, Mongolia, China, Japan, Cuba, Australia, all through Europe. And anywhere there's a train, I've taken one. I've even taken the Amtrak. I've been that desperate. I love trains dearly, but I recognize they have limitations. And planes are just, well, let's just say when the Allies rolled over the Axis powers in 1944, they did not. They flew their stuff in. I'll put it that way. They used aircraft. God bless the DC-3. I think there's
the Liberty ship
one hanging off the roof just there. You can't quite see it. And the Liberty ship, of course, yeah.
Yeah, this last one from Matthew is pretty good. Would you rather fix NASA or replace NASA?
I really love the NASA brand. I think it's meaningful. I think it's important. I think I have here. I'll just pull it out. Got my passport, right? So I've got an Australian passport and a US passport, and the Australian passport has pictures of animals that will fuck you up. So
Not all of them. Most of them are rather docile. Don't scare them.
there's a goanna, right?
Don't
Yeah,
scare the
don't well,
Americans.
okay. Officially, these animals aren't poisonous, but you know better than that. And then on the American passport, you've got like "Let freedom ring from all the hills," and this is what is America is all about. We say farewell from Lyndon B. Johnson, and all these quotes. And here's a picture of a train, the Transcontinental Railroad. And at the end, it's like, and by the way, we own space. Um, and I really think that like this is a promise from United States to the rest of the world, under the Bretton Woods type system, that like we are going to end mercantilism, and we're going to introduce globalism. We're going to keep the sea lanes safe, and we're going to guarantee freedom for the future of humanity. And I think NASA really embodies that promise. I don't think it's lived up to that promise. I would rather repair what we have from NASA than replace it. I would have to say, given the last week's events, I'm not optimistic about either occurring anytime soon. The reality is, and this is the reality, SpaceX is wealthy enough that, barring some terrible misfortune, they will be able to build a moon base, and they will be able to build a Mars base if they so choose on their own dime. And the conversation that will need to be had in very soon is like, it's a question about branding rights. It's not like NASA's leading this. NASA's paying the money. NASA's specifying the design. NASA's contributing major parts of the system. It's like SpaceX subcontracted out the rovers to Caterpillar, and NASA is asking if they can get a sticker on the side of it. And that to me is so tragic, because there are tens of thousands of really talented people at NASA whose skills are being locked up and gated and squandered by a kind of fairly unintentional. It's not like there's a bad guy out there who's trying to make this happen. But actually a good outcome requires intentionality in that direction, and we haven't had that.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Casey. That was a tour de force as always. Much appreciated. I hope everybody got some of what they came for and a little bit more. We will see you all next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks.